we are super fortunate today to have Ms. Steinerman with us. And I want you to think about, today we have the internet, we have TV, and before that the printing press gave us the written word all over the place. Before the written word, how did people share history? How did they do that? They told each other. They told stories. They shared their family stories. One of the ways we learn about each other and learn about our history and learn about our families is by telling our family stories. Today, we're fortunate to have Ms. Steinerman be able to share one of her family stories with us about survival, about luck, and about kindness of others around them. So, Ms. Steinerman is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, also known as a 2G or second generation survivor. She is a first generation American born in New York who grew up in a small extended family from Eastern Europe. Debbie is the president and co-founder of the Vermont Holocaust Memorial, which is a volunteer organization committed to teaching the lessons from the Holocaust by honoring the lives lost and sharing stories of survival. By engaging in educating the Vermont community, VTHM envisions a time when prejudice, bigotry, and hatred will be replaced with respect for all. Debbie lives in Cambridge with her husband and has 2 grown children. How many of you live in Cambridge? Okay. So she's your neighbor. Okay? So she's one of us. So I turn the floor over to Debbie.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Eugene Grunstein, Joseph Grunstein, Ignaz Grunstein, Gisela Grunstein Horn, Serena Horn Lang, Elisabetta Horn Bauer, Emil Bauer, Mina Grunstein Newman, Ludwig Newman, Morris Sonnenschein, Ferry Sonnenschein, William Elephant, Linka Cohn, Giza Cohn, Heinrich Cohn, Erica Cohn, David Kovari, Erna Kovari, Blanca Grog Kovari, Bela Grog, Valerie Kovari Deutsch, Janka Pless, Max Pless. Those are 23 of my relatives. 23 that include aunts, uncles, cousins, children, grown-ups, teenagers, and my grandfather. They were killed in the Holocaust. There were others, other family members, I'm sure, that were also killed. I don't have their names. Other relatives. These 23, I never got to know. Anybody know what the Holocaust was? Anybody can give me a definition of some sort.
The Holocaust was when the Nazis were trying to kill all the Jews that they could because Hitler had a perspective of a German person that he wanted everyone to be.
Very good. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution, discrimination, and murder of 6 million Jews by Hitler's Nazi regime and its collaborators, I mean people that worked with Hitler, between 1933 and 1945 across Europe and beyond. It was Hitler's intent to wipe out every Jew in Europe and then continue on. Just this week, we commemorated 83 years since what was called Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10th in 1938, the night of broken glass. That's what Kristallnacht means. It was a time when the Nazis coordinated a wave of anti-Semitic, which is anti-Jewish violence, in Nazi Germany and in Austria. It was named because the Nazis and German citizens smashed windows of Jewish stores, smashed windows and burned Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues, their houses of worship. And that shattered glass was all along the ground. It's the night of broken glass. And many people see that event as the true beginning of the Holocaust. 91 Jewish men were killed that night. 30,000 were taken away to forced labor, concentration camps. So this is a map of Europe. It shows Jewish communities around Europe and in the Soviet Union. It tells about how many Jews there were in these different countries before the Holocaust, before World War II, and how many from those areas, how many Jews in that area were murdered during the Holocaust. The circled area is the part of Europe my family comes from. Small area up there is Slovakia and Hungary. My family came from an area that was right on the border of Slovakia and Hungary. You can see in Slovakia, before the war, there was 137,000 Jews living. The Nazis killed 66,250 from Slovakia, about half. In Hungary, there were 825,000 Jews living in Hungary. 565,000 of that 825 were killed by the Nazis. And you can see in other areas, larger populations, larger amounts of Jews that were killed. They were reaching all over. There are smaller ones further away, because that's further away from Germany and Austria and Poland. They were planning to get down there. They were planning to get everywhere. I'm going to tell you the story of my mother, Eva, and her sister, Kathy. They lived in a small village in what is Slovakia now, near the Hungarian border. The town's name was Nové Zámky. It was a typical small Eastern European town. It had a town square, it had parks, it had churches, it had synagogues, Jewish houses of worship. It had schools, had a movie theater. The bottom picture is my grandfather's store in that town. He owned a houseware store that sold pots, pans, dishes, glasses, linens, anything you need to keep your house running. He was popular, he was well-liked, he was well-known. The family was known in the town. They got along with everyone, their neighbors, friends. They were well-liked. They did well. The store was well visited, and Eva and Kathy grew up comfortably. They had music lessons, sports teams that they were part of, language lessons, in addition to their regular schooling. This is a picture of Eva and Kathy in 1934 in their elementary school, which was specifically a Jewish elementary school. At that time, they were allowed. These were all Jewish children from the town that went to this school. A good number of these children never grew up. They were killed in the Holocaust. By 1938, they were no longer allowed to have a Jewish school, no longer allowed to go to a Jewish school. Eva and Kathy went to a public school for a little while, and then even that, by 1942, they were not allowed to take part in anymore. Jews were not allowed to own stores. My grandfather's store was taken away. Jews were not allowed to go to parks. Jews were not allowed to go to shop in stores after certain hours or during certain hours. There were more and more restrictions being placed on them as time went on. But Eva and Kathy had a very comfortable life. They lived a life very similar to what you live now. They had friends. They were able to go to the local pool. They went to the park. They took music lessons, as I said. They were out and about. They lived their life as best they could until these restrictions got very severe. The Jews had to start wearing yellow stars on their clothing to identify them. Their identification papers would be stamped with a J for Jude. Things were being taken away. They couldn't go to school anymore, so they had to learn some kind of a profession or get a job. My mother, Eva, decided to go to Hungary, to Budapest, which was not far away, to learn to be a photographer's assistant. While she was there, she took this picture, which totally blew my mind. She's standing in 1942 along the Danube River near a very famous bridge, which is in the background. A few years later, in that same spot, something happened, and now there's a memorial. Can anybody tell me what they think that memorial is about? Go ahead.
They shove all the Jews in the water and that's why all the shoes are there?
Something like that, yes. So they told the Jews to take off their shoes and then they shot them. A whole line of Jews. They shot them, their bodies fell into the Danube River. Danube River was a moving river, kind of like the Lamoille, washed the bodies away. The shoes remained. This is a memorial. These are not real shoes. These are stone or made out of iron. This is a memorial to those Jews that were killed there. Why do you think they tell them to take off their shoes before they shot them?
Because it might be something of value to them.
Exactly. Amazing, right? Shoes. They were trying to keep whatever they could that belonged to Jews. The shoes were valuable. During the war, everything was in limited supply, including shoes. Some of the shoes were new. Some of them were nice. They were kept well. The Nazis wanted them, kept them for themselves, or they could sell them. They could trade them. Why not? Why not take what they could before it got washed away, right? So, amazingly, my mother had a picture in that same spot a couple of years later. Other Jews were lined up there and shot and killed. While my mother was in Hungary, in Budapest, as I said, she went to learn to be a photographer's assistant. She met a young man, became her boyfriend. His name was Hansi. Hansi worked with the underground resistance. Does anybody know what the underground resistance was? Not exactly. Go ahead.
Was it like the rebellion against the Nazis who planted bombs on their trains to stop them from transporting goods and stuff?
Yes. The resistance did some of that.
Was the Boston Tea Party?
Not exactly like the Boston Tea Party, no. The underground resistance is Jewish and non-Jewish groups that defied the Nazis, both in Germany and wherever Germany was occupying. These groups attempted armed physical resistance as well as tried to help hide Jews. So yes, they fought back, but they also tried to help in other ways. Hansi tried to help my mother. He knew what was coming because he was working with the resistance. He had another girlfriend who was not Jewish. He got that girlfriend's original identification papers, and he was going to give that to my mother. My mother had to learn everything she could about this non-Jewish girl named Anna, because my mother, Eva, in 1943, at the age of about 17, 18, had to become Anna. She had to pretend she was Anna. She had to know Anna's birth date. She had to know Anna's address. She had to know Anna's parents. She had to know where Anna lived, where she grew up, what school she went to. She had to know everything she could, because if she was questioned, she had to be this other woman. She had to be Anna. My mother had brown hair. She dyed it blonde. Anna was blonde. Anna was what the Nazis thought of as a pure Aryan. This is a picture of my mother when she went into hiding. As you can see, now she's blonde. She went to one night she went to the edge of a river, local river, dressed in her coat with its telltale Jewish star, her own, Eva's own original identification papers in her pocketbook. She covered her dyed blonde hair, went to this riverside, left her coat with the star, left her pocketbook with her own identification papers, and with a suicide note inside, saying she didn't want to live under these restrictions. She didn't like living like this anymore. She took off her hat that was covering her hair, left everything there, and faked suicide. She faked that she jumped in and died. And then she ran off, met Hansi. He found a job for her in rural Hungary, far away from the big city, as a nanny. She got the job as a nanny because she knew languages. She could help the students with their homework with languages. She knew sports. She could play with the kids. She knew music. She took music lessons as a child. She can help them with their music lessons. She was talented. She became Anna, the nanny. You can see in this picture on the top right, she's wearing a crucifix. Jews didn't wear crucifixes. If anything, they would wear a Star of David. Jews never wore crucifixes. She wore a crucifix because she's pretending to be a non-Jew with a different name. She had to go with this family to church. She went with this family on vacations. She went with them to parties. She took the kids to school. She lived with this family. We don't know if they had any idea that she wasn't Anna or that she was really Jewish. Had they known, had that family been found out that they were protecting a Jew, they would have the same fate as a Jew at that time. They would have been arrested, including the children, taken away and sent to a labor camp, a concentration camp, or an extermination camp. They would have had to do hard labor, or they could have been, all of them, killed, just like a Jew. While my mother was working as a nanny in Hungary, 1943, 44, early 45, her sister Kathy stayed home, stayed in their hometown, stayed with her mother, with her family at home. Their father, in about 1942 or early 1943, was taken to hard labor with the other men of the town, other Jewish men. And from the hard labor, those Jewish men were transported to concentration camps all over Europe that were run by the Nazis. Some were in extermination camps, some were labor camps. He was sent from hard labor to an extermination camp where he worked for a little while, and then he was sent to the gas chambers and killed. My aunt Kathy was still with her mother in the town, but they started hearing inklings of things that are happening far away. They started hearing about these concentration camps. They started hearing about what's been happening to Jews, and they were getting prepared. My mother learned to be a photographer's assistant. Kathy became a music teacher. This is a picture in 1943 of Kathy's students. They were all Jewish, because by then Jews could only work with other Jews, could only take lessons from other Jews, teach other Jews. That was it. You're not allowed to mingle. All of those students, not one of them survived the Holocaust. Kathy's most treasured possession was her accordion. She heard that the Jews were starting to get rounded up in their town, in their neighboring towns. She took her accordion and buried it in her backyard. It was her most treasured possession, but she knew she couldn't carry this thing. It's fairly big. I have it now. She buried it in the backyard, with the hope that she'd be able to get it at some point, come back, or somebody else would. And then the people that were left, the Jews that were left in their town of Novi Zamki and the neighboring areas, were put in a ghetto. Does anybody know what a ghetto is? Have you heard of a ghetto? Anybody can tell me an idea of what the ghetto is? There were a few ghettos around in that time. This is the definition of a ghetto. A ghetto was a section of a city where all the Jews from neighboring areas were forced to live. Surrounded by barbed wire or walls, Nazi ghettos were often sealed so people were prevented from leaving or entering. Ghettos were characterized by overcrowding, starvation, forced labor, and the ghettos were destroyed by the Nazis when they sent the Jews to the death camps. Kathy and her mother and the remaining Jews of their town and the neighboring areas were sent to a ghetto in early 1944. The ghetto that they were all put in was not a little town. It was a brick factory. It was a building that was there just to make bricks that they took over just to put all the Jews in there for a time being before they could take them and deport them to a concentration camp. In June of 1944, the Jews of Slovakia were sent to the Auschwitz extermination camp. They were put on cattle cars, on trains, jammed in there with no food, no water, no bathroom. Basically, they had a bucket, and it took a couple of days until they arrived at the most infamous concentration camp, extermination camp of the Nazi regime, Auschwitz in Poland. Kathy was young. She was strong. She was a little older than you, not much. She was talented. She was smart. She held on tight to her mother when they got off these train transports. People that got off the train were separated into two lines. Men on one side, women on the other side. Straight line, marched forward, and then in front of a doctor who decided whether you live or die. Go to the left, go to the right. Go to the left, you go to the gas chambers, and you die. Go to the right, and you live a little longer because they needed you. You were useful to the Nazis. Kathy was lucky. She was sent to the right. She was useful. She had talent. She was strong. She held on tight to her mother, and she took her mother with her. They were put into barracks, like you see on the bottom picture, crowded in there. These are women all crowded into these barracks. The barracks had no bathroom. They were lucky if they got a tiny piece of bread and some dirty coffee water in the morning. And in the evening, if they got what they called soup, which was made from potato peelings of some rotten vegetables, and dirty water in the evening, and that was it. There was no bathroom there. The bathrooms were outside. Didn't matter if it was 90 degrees outside or if it was minus 30. This was Poland. It was cold in the winter. It was freezing in the winter. You can see these women are all bundled up. They had to go outside to use a bathroom, not a bathroom like you and I have, basically a hole in a piece of wood. Kathy was chosen to be part of the Auschwitz Orchestra. Can you imagine a prison? And a prison is a nice thing. These were not prisons. This was a concentration camp. This was an extermination camp, meaning where they killed people. Okay? It had an orchestra. Why would it have an orchestra? Any ideas? Go ahead. Entertainment for who? For the Nazis, yes. The Nazis were very cultured people. The Germans are very cultured people. They loved music, they loved art. They believed very strongly in being surrounded by that. And yes, the Nazis wanted some music and they wanted some entertainment while they worked there. But if you look at this drawing, what do you see? Do you see other prisoners in there, right? On the side. The orchestra was playing marching music to make sure the prisoners marched off to labor. And when they came back at the end of a very, very, very long day, it was usually 16 hours of labor, how strong could they feel with so little sustenance? The marching music was supposed to help them move and get back and line up and be counted. And that's where they put Kathy at first, in the Auschwitz Orchestra, because she was a musician. But this was late 1944. The war effort for the Nazis was not going well. The Nazis needed more help in their factories. And Kathy was sent to work in an armaments factory. In the armaments factory, they made airplane parts. The Nazis were hoping that their Air Force would get more supplies. They needed them, and she was put on a machine in a factory to make airplane parts. In that factory, she worked for a civilian foreman who was German. He was not a Nazi military man. He was a boss that happened to have been a German citizen, only spoke German. All the other prisoners that were working in this factory, in this room, at the time, they were Polish or they were Czech, Slovak. They didn't speak German. But remember, Kathy took language lessons as a child. She spoke Hungarian at home, she spoke Slovak in school, she learned German, she learned some other languages as well. She could speak German. She spoke and responded to this foreman. And they got a friendship going because he was so happy to be able to speak to someone in his language who could speak back. And because they were able to converse, he found a little fondness for her and caring for her. And every morning she would find a morsel, an extra piece of bread hidden under her machine that she had to work on that day. She'd put that piece of bread in her pocket, hide it, because it was very valuable. And at night, she took it back to her mother, who was still in the barracks. And that extra piece of bread helped them survive. It was close to the end of the war. Every little bit helped. This is a picture of my Aunt Kathy's arm. You see on there, she has a tattoo with numbers. Prisoners that were sent to labor in Auschwitz and were not killed right away were tattooed with an identification number. That number proves Kathy was in Auschwitz. Only in Auschwitz did they get those tattoos. Auschwitz was the biggest of all the concentration and extermination camps. That number became her identity. She was no longer Kathy Grunstein. She was now this number. She had to answer whenever that number was called. They would have attendance in the morning, they would have attendance in the evening, and the attendance was not by name. The attendance was by number. And if you didn't show up and they found you, they'd kill you. And you'd have to know that number because they would call it out, because they would send you to this labor, to do that labor by number. She had it on her arm. She's not going to forget it. 1945, the war ended. The camp, Auschwitz, was liberated. Kathy and her mother made their way back home to their hometown. They survived, thankfully. At that point, they didn't know where my mother was. My mother didn't know where they were. No one was able to keep in touch with anybody else. My mother was in rural Hungary. Kathy and her mother were in a concentration camp. My grandfather was killed. Families were separated. My mother left the family she was working for in rural Hungary, made her way back to the big city of Budapest in Hungary, and met up with her boyfriend and some others from the underground there. And they were hoping to make their way to Yugoslavia, which was free at that time totally. Unfortunately, there were still Nazis in Budapest at this time, and they got captured. Remember, my mother understood and spoke German. The Nazis were speaking to each other in German about their captors. She understood everything that they were saying to each other. She knew what they were going to ask. She still had the original ID papers of Anna. She was still pretending to be Anna. The Nazis didn't know that she wasn't Anna. All they had was these original papers, not a copy, original papers of Anna. As far as they were concerned, she was Anna. And she could answer all the questions about Anna. She didn't flinch. She smiled at these Nazis because she knew they didn't know the truth. And she knew all the answers. And she was very, very lucky, and she survived. And she was lucky that she survived the 2 years that she was with that family, and they were never found out that she was there and who she was. And her boyfriend also, similarly, was lucky and survived the questioning, and they were able to be released. Not everybody that got captured at that time was so lucky. They made their way to free Yugoslavia, and in time, my mother and Kathy and their mother reunited back in their town in Nové Zámky in Slovakia. They found each other. They were thrilled to find that they all survived. Unfortunately, their father was killed, amongst other relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins. But they got back together again. My mother decided she did not want to live in that town anymore. Of the 3,000 Jews that lived in their town before the war, less than 500 returned. My mother went and found a place to live in Italy in what was called a displaced persons camp, a DP camp. Displaced persons were those survivors from the Holocaust that had nowhere to live. They were homeless. Their homes were destroyed or taken from them. All their belongings were taken from them. They had no family left. They were the lone survivors. And there were a number of these displaced persons camps created by the Allies after the war. My mother stayed in one in Italy for about a year. From there, she made her way to Israel. She lived there for a couple of years and then moved to New York. Kathy, still the devoted daughter, stayed in her hometown with her mother. She got married, she had a family. And in 1965, my mother was able to help Kathy and her family move to New York as well. Now, if Kathy and my mother Eva didn't survive, all these family members wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be here. I'm in that picture. My children are in that picture. Some of my cousins are in that picture. Kathy's daughter and son and their children and grandchildren are in that picture. And there's even more now. This was in 2014. One life saved can save a world. If it wasn't for these upstanding people, upstanders we call them, who dared to help, who dared to give their papers, who dared to give food, who dared to hide people, the few survivors wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. Of the 9 million Jews that lived in Europe before World War II, 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. That's 2/3. Of those 6 million Jews murdered, 1.5 million, 1.5 million were children, like you, younger than you, a little older than you, from infants to teenagers. 1.5 million were killed. We don't want that to ever happen again. We don't want any of this to ever happen again. Of the 137,000 Jews in Slovakia, the country that my family came from, as I said in the beginning, 66,250 were killed. Now, Jews weren't the only ones that the Nazis targeted. That was their big plan, was to eliminate all the Jews. But the physically disabled, homeless, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay, communists, criminals, Polish, Slavs. The Nazis had plans, and none of these people to them were perfect. We're not the perfect Aryan specimens. These people were also arrested. 11 million total were killed by the Nazis. Of the 11 million, 6 million, more than half were Jews. You don't want to be one of those. You never know who's going to be the next person who's going to be targeted. We don't want this to ever happen again. We have to be careful. We have to be careful of what we say, what we do, how we act. Our attitudes, our bullying, our acts, they multiply, and they can turn into what happened in the Holocaust. Genocide at the very top. Now, thankfully, that doesn't happen most of the time. If you're bullying somebody, it doesn't mean that a whole group of people are going to get killed. But let's not start with that. Let's make sure that if we hear somebody say something mean about somebody else, we call them out on it. Tell somebody, that's not right. What if it was you? The Jews were targeted in the Holocaust, but it could have been just as easily someone else, some other group. And if these people didn't help my family, we wouldn't be here. And if it's somebody else, you have to make sure that you're going to help them, because you never know when you're going to need their help. So this pyramid of hate shows how things escalate. We don't want that to ever happen. A very famous Holocaust survivor and scholar named Elie Wiesel once said, "The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference, not caring." You don't have to love everybody. We're not saying that. But you have to care. Don't be a bystander when you see someone bullying. Don't be a bystander when you see somebody saying something mean about someone else. Be an upstander. Be someone who will point it out and call it out that it's wrong, because you never know when you're going to be on the other side of that, and you want somebody to help you. And that's what Elie Wiesel is saying. Be the upstander. Be the helper. One more time, I want you to see the names of my relatives. 23 relatives that I know whose future was cut short. Who knew what these people could have been? They could have cured cancer. They could have cured COVID. They could have gotten us to Mars by now. They could have invented a time machine. They could have been a teacher, a lawyer, a mechanic, anything. They couldn't be anything. They weren't allowed. They were taken, their potential was taken away from them and from the world. We all lost out because these people were killed, and 6 million others as well, 11 million total. Let's not let this happen again. Yes, you have a question. I'm sorry? My grandfather is the one on top, the one that says Jenno Grunstein. First one on the list was my grandfather. And then all the Grunsteins are his brothers and sisters and other relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, and then on the other side of my family as well. And those people are gone. I never got to meet my grandfather because he was killed. I never got to meet any of these relatives. I missed out on cousins and aunts and uncles. I could have had a huge family. I have a very small family. I was lucky to have the family that I have. So the lesson is, from my family's experience to you, go home, talk to your family, learn the lessons of your history. Make sure you listen to your friends. Listen to people that are not necessarily your friends, but care about them. Make sure that they're taken care of. The Nazis wanted everybody to be the same, everyone to be just like them. Our world is beautiful because we're so different. We need to care about each other. We don't want to go through something like this ever again. We all bleed the same. We all have hearts, we all grow, we all should care about each other. Anybody have any other questions for me? Anything you want to know about? I'm here to let you know anything you want about my family's life, about my life. Go ahead.
Is your mom still alive?
My mother is not alive anymore, no, unfortunately. That's why I'm here. My mother would tell her story if she could. My mother's not around. Now it's my responsibility as her survivor. That's why I'm called a 2G. I'm a second generation survivor. My mother was the first generation. She's the one that survived. It's my responsibility to share her story and the lessons from her story now. Go ahead.
How long after the war were you born?
Was I born after the war?
Yeah, how long?
I was born in 1961.
Oh, so
That's I was born in New York, quite a bit later. My parents were older by the time I was born. They were much older than usual at that time. Go ahead.
Was your mom's boyfriend who helped her figure out how to stay alive or whatever? Is your dad?
No, they broke up actually after the war at some point. I usually get the question, what happened to the boyfriend?
But you said you had the accordion,
Yes, I do.
and does anybody play it?
No, it's kept very carefully locked away. It's, a very sentimental, valuable piece of history to us.
After the war, did your family inherit the shop back?
Did I do what?
After the war, did your family inherit the shop back?
Did they inherit what?
Your grandmother had a shop.
Oh, the shop?
Did your family inherit that back?
The shop was gone. It was taken from them during the war. They were very lucky that they were able to get back the apartment that they lived in at the time, but the store didn't exist anymore. It was ransacked. It was taken by non-Jews.
I'm not sure if you said this, but what happened to Anna? Or was there just two Annas walking?
No. Well, see, that's the thing. That's why my mother didn't stay in the big city of Budapest, because there was another Anna there. And they didn't want to have the chance that the two of them will show up in the same place at the same time. So my mother was put to work as a nanny in the rural Hungary, far away, so that wouldn't happen. What happened to Anna after the war? My mother resumed her original identity. She became herself again. She didn't need to use the false identity anymore. They never met. My mother and Anna never met. My mother really didn't want to meet Anna because Anna was another girlfriend of this boyfriend. And she didn't want to meet her. Go ahead.
how long ago did
your mother pass?
My mother passed away about 27 years ago.
When did you start doing this?
When did I, what?
When did you start doing this?
So my organization started in 2017, Vermont Holocaust Memorial. We were started by myself and 2 other daughters of Holocaust survivors in Vermont to share these stories, to teach these lessons. We started in 2017 when we found out that there was no such organization in the state. There's no museum in the state. And it was needed. There were teachers and schools that wanted to come to a temporary exhibit that we put up in Stowe. And teachers wanted to bring classes to that because they had no other way of teaching these stories to their students. It was a temporary exhibit. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 4 months. And we said, well, this is needed. So here we are 4 years later. Still needed, unfortunately. Go ahead.
Is it just you who goes around to the schools, or do the other people go around?
No, we have 2 or 3 other speakers in different parts of the state. This afternoon, another speaker is coming to speak to another group in your school. And each of us has a very different story. Each family has a different story of survival. We wouldn't be here if our parents didn't survive. So they are stories of survival. But each one is very, very different. You had a question?
How did you end up with the accordion? How did that?
How did I end up what?
How did you end up with the accordion?
With the accordion?
Yeah.
Well, Kathy survived. So she was able to dig up her accordion when she got back to her hometown. And she kept it and she used it. And when she passed away, her daughter was living in Israel. I don't know how I ended up getting it. Her son was living in New York, but somehow I ended up with the accordion. I don't remember why. Oh, I think because we had this exhibit, actually, in 2017, when we started our organization. And when we had this exhibit, we put the accordion out as part of the exhibit. So I got it from, I think, my cousin in New York, and then I ended up keeping it. You had a question? Who has a, you have a question?
Did the family that your mom was a nanny for ever find out, or any of their relatives?
I have no idea. The one that she worked as a nanny for, you're talking about. I have no idea. I don't know if, they may have known that she was placed there, but it was never discussed, ever. They probably didn't want the children to know for sure, because who knows what children will say. But they may not have known themselves. She was placed as a nanny because she had these talents that were really useful as a nanny. Yeah.
When your mother faked suicide to take on Anna's life, did anybody ever find that? Do you know?
If anybody ever found the suicide note?
Yeah.
Never asked. I don't know. I don't know. I never heard whether any Nazis went looking or went back to the family. They did, my mother and her boyfriend Hansi did warn her mother, my grandmother, that they may hear something. Don't believe anything you hear. And that was really all they told them about what my mother was going to do. My grandmother trusted Hansi. He was a very strong guy. He was well placed in the underground. And they hoped for the best, and that's all. They didn't want them to know anything, because any more information that they had could only hurt them. Whether anybody came afterwards, I never asked, I never knew. There's a lot of things I don't know about my mother's story. I know very little about my father's story. He also somehow survived in a different way. Most children of survivors, a lot of children of survivors, their parents never shared the stories. I'm very lucky my mother shared the story with me before she passed. Many don't know anything until they have children. So the survivors are grandparents, and then all of a sudden they decide, our grandchildren need to hear this. And then the children all of a sudden hear the real story. They're grown up like me, and then they have children, and these stories are very important. Yeah,
I thought that your mom, she not married Hunsey.
I can't hear you.
I thought that she married Hunsey.
No, she did not marry Hunsey. She did not. They broke up, and she decided she didn't want to stay around in Eastern Europe anymore. She went to the displaced persons camp in Italy, where she lived for a year, and then she moved on to Israel. And Hunsey, I don't know what happened to Hunsey. You know, his boyfriend, girlfriend, they broke up. He had other girlfriends, remember?
Wait, he was cheating on her?
No, I don't know. I don't think there was any, I don't know if there was cheating going on. I mean, they had,
You said he had another girlfriend.
well, the other girlfriend was Anna.
I thought you were talking about like the same time it was happening.
At the time, he had multiple, you know, he had other girls that were friends. Anna was one, my mother was one. Anna was willing to give up her identification papers so that my mother, another girlfriend of Hunsey's, was able to live. Yes?
Who is your father?
Who is my father? my father is a Kovari. You saw the names Kovari up there? My father was a Kovari, Andrew Kovari. My father somehow had the foresight in September of 1939. His family came from a similar area in Slovakia, but my parents didn't know each other back then. My father had somehow foresight to get on a train in September of 1939 and leave Slovakia just before the Nazis really came in and took over. And he made his way through Italy and the south of France, and he made it up to Paris. He gambled his way across, and he got up there, and he joined the army in Paris. And then when the Nazis came into Paris just before, in 1940, he transferred over to the United Kingdom, to England, and he joined the army in England. And he was in the British Army in England for a few years. He lived in England, and then after the war, he made it to New York. So they met in New York. Anything else? Any other questions of any kind? I'm here. If you think of something later, feel free to email me. Any questions, any concerns, please. And the teachers as well, anytime. We're here. Thank you. Thank you all.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you. You were wonderful audience members this morning, and I wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all. You were very good audience. Thank you.
That was good.